The Mitsubishi A6M2-N, known to the Allies as Rufe, was Japan's most famous seaplane fighter of World War II and a direct floatplane adaptation of the legendary Zero. Created to defend remote island bases across the vast Pacific where airfields did not yet exist, the Rufe retained the Zero's extraordinary maneuverability while sacrificing speed for the ability to operate from open water. First entering combat in 1942, the Rufe shocked Allied pilots who initially mistook it for a standard Zero, only to realize too late that it could rise directly from lagoons, bays, and anchorages. Armed with two 20mm Type 99 cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns, it was deadly in skilled hands, particularly during early campaigns in the Aleutians, Solomon Islands, and Southeast Asia. However, the added drag of its large central float reduced top speed and climb rate, making it vulnerable once faster Allied fighters like the P-38 Lightning and F-6F Hellcat arrived. Despite this, Japanese pilots used the Rufe aggressively for interception, convoy escort, and even ground attack. It served as a stopgap fighter that bought Japan valuable time during the war's early expansion and remains the most successful floatplane fighter ever to see large-scale combat in World War II history. Operating in some of the harshest weather conditions of the Second World War, the Aleutian-based Rufes proved that seaplane fighters were not just tropical weapons. These aircraft launched from freezing waters under constant fog, rain, and wind while defending Japanese positions on Attu and Kiska. The cold environment strained engines and pilots alike, yet the Rufe's simplicity and Zero lineage allowed it to remain operational where conventional fighters struggled. In combat, Rufes ambushed American P-40 Warhawks and P-39 Airacobras, achieving surprise attacks from unexpected directions over open sea. While never numerous, their psychological impact was disproportionate to their numbers, forcing the USAAF to treat every contact as a potential fighter threat even far from land. This niche but effective deployment showed how seaplane fighters extended air defense into regions previously thought uncontestable. The Kawanishi N1K1 Kyōfu, codenamed Rex by the Allies, represented Japan's attempt to build a purpose-designed seaplane fighter rather than a floatplane conversion. Unlike the Rufe, the Kyofu featured a powerful engine, heavy armament of four 20mm cannons, and a sleek aerodynamic float design. Intended to counter high-altitude bombers and fast Allied fighters, the Rex had excellent firepower and stability, but arrived too late and in too few numbers to influence the war. Nevertheless, its design laid the foundation for the legendary land-based N1KJ Shiden, one of Japan's best late-war fighters. The Kyofu stands as proof that seaplane fighters were evolving rapidly before airfield construction overtook their strategic necessity. The Arado Ar 196 was Germany's most successful and most widely used seaplane fighter reconnaissance aircraft of World War II, and unlike many experimental floatplane fighters, it proved itself repeatedly in real combat across multiple theaters. Designed primarily for shipborne operations, the 196 Malagasy Arrieres operated from battleships, cruisers, and remote coastal bases, extending German air power far beyond the reach of land-based runways. Entering service in 1939, it quickly became the standard reconnaissance and defensive fighter for major Kriegsmarine surface vessels such as the Bismarck, Tirpitz, and Admiral Grafspee. Unlike Japanese seaplane fighters that relied on extreme agility, the 196 Malagasy Arrieres emphasized ruggedness, stability, and heavy armament, making it exceptionally effective against enemy patrol aircraft and lightly armed bombers. Equipped with 20mm cannons and machine guns, it could easily overpower Allied flying boats, reconnaissance aircraft, and even challenge early war fighters under favorable conditions. In the Atlantic and Arctic Oceans, 196 Malagasy Arrieres crews hunted Allied patrol planes, attacked submarines, and conducted coastal strikes, sometimes forcing enemy aircraft to ditch at sea under fire. Its twin-float configuration provided excellent stability in rough waters, allowing operations in harsh conditions where many seaplanes would fail. While it was not fast enough to compete with late-war Allied fighters, the 196 Malagasy Arrieres remained valuable throughout the conflict due to its versatility and reliability. It embodied Germany's doctrine of using seaplane fighters as multi-role naval aircraft, rather than pure dogfighters. By war's end, the 196 Malagasy Arrieres had earned a reputation as one of the most effective Axis seaplanes of the entire war, proving that a well-armed floatplane could dominate vast maritime areas when used intelligently and supported by naval power. The Supermarine Spitfire floatplane stands as one of the most fascinating and dramatic experimental fighter concepts of World War II, representing Britain's attempt to combine one of history's greatest fighters with the operational flexibility of a seaplane. Developed in 1942 during a period when Britain feared rapid Japanese expansion in the Indian Ocean and Pacific, the floatplane Spitfire was intended as an emergency solution to defend remote islands and coastal bases where airfields were unavailable or vulnerable to attack. Engineers replaced the Spitfire's iconic landing gear with large twin floats, significantly altering the aircraft's balance, weight, and aerodynamic performance. Despite these challenges, test flights revealed that the float-equipped Spitfire retained much of its legendary handling, climb rate, and responsiveness, making it one of the most agile seaplane fighters ever flown. However, the added drag reduced top speed and range, limiting its practical combat effectiveness against modern enemy fighters. As Allied engineering units rapidly constructed airstrips across contested regions, the strategic need for a floatplane Spitfire quickly vanished. Although it never entered combat, the project demonstrated how adaptable the Spitfire design truly was and how desperate wartime planners were to ensure air cover in every possible environment. The floatplane Spitfire remains a powerful what-if of aviation history, symbolizing a moment when even the most iconic land-based fighters were reimagined for naval survival warfare over open seas. The Hawker Hurricane floatplane was Britain's most practical attempt to field an operational seaplane fighter during World War II, and unlike the Spitfire floatplane, it actually reached limited service use. Based on the rugged and reliable Hurricane airframe, the floatplane version was designed to provide temporary fighter defense for isolated ports, convoys, and forward bases, where runways were unavailable or under constant threat of attack. First tested in 1941, the Hurricane floatplane sacrificed speed and range in exchange for operational flexibility, but it retained the aircraft's solid gun platform and forgiving handling characteristics. Armed with multiple machine guns, it was capable of intercepting enemy reconnaissance aircraft, escorting convoys, and deterring low-level attacks on shipping. While it could not match modern enemy fighters in speed, it was well suited for defensive patrols and short-range interception missions over water. The Hurricane floatplane saw service in regions such as the Mediterranean and was evaluated for use in the Far East before Allied airfield construction reduced the need for such aircraft. Its existence highlighted the transitional phase of naval air warfare, where seaplane fighters served as stopgap solutions bridging the gap between naval vulnerability and permanent air superiority. Though overshadowed by more famous fighters, the Hurricane floatplane demonstrated that rugged land-based designs could be adapted to maritime roles with reasonable success when strategic necessity demanded it. The Curtiss P-40 floatplane was one of America's most serious experiments in converting a frontline land-based fighter into a seaplane interceptor during the early years of World War II, reflecting urgent fears that remote Pacific islands and forward naval anchorages could be attacked without any airfield-based defense. As Japanese forces rapidly advanced across the Pacific in 1941 and 1942, US planners recognized that conventional fighters were useless without runways, prompting engineers to explore float-equipped versions of existing combat aircraft. The P-40 Warhawk, already proven as a rugged and heavily armed fighter, was chosen for modification due to its durability and availability. Fitted with large floats in place of its landing gear, the P-40 floatplane retained its powerful Allison engine and heavy armament, theoretically giving it the firepower to intercept enemy bombers and fighters over water. Test flights demonstrated that while the aircraft remained stable and controllable, the added drag from the floats significantly reduced speed, climb rate, and maneuverability, erasing much of the Warhawk's combat advantage. In mock combat scenarios, the floatplane P-40 struggled against faster aircraft, making it clear that it would be vulnerable in real engagements against experienced enemy pilots. As Allied engineers rapidly built airstrips across newly secured islands, the strategic need for a floatplane Warhawk disappeared almost as quickly as it had arisen. Although it never entered combat, the P-40 floatplane stands as a revealing snapshot of wartime improvisation, showing how even major air forces were willing to experiment with radical adaptations to maintain air defense in the most remote and vulnerable regions of the war. The Vought OS-2U Kingfisher was never designed to be a fighter, yet during World War II it found itself pressed into air combat roles that blurred the line between reconnaissance aircraft and seaplane interceptor. Originally built as a ship-launched observation and artillery spotting aircraft, the Kingfisher operated from battleships, cruisers, and coastal bases across every major naval theater of the war. However, in remote areas where no fighters were available, Kingfishers were sometimes forced to intercept enemy reconnaissance aircraft, flying boats, and even bombers threatening Allied fleets and coastal installations. Armed with light machine guns and possessing excellent low-speed handling, the OS-2U relied on surprise, teamwork, and pilot skill rather than speed or firepower. There were instances where Kingfisher crews aggressively attacked enemy floatplanes and patrol aircraft, forcing them to withdraw or crash land at sea. Though completely outmatched by true fighters, the Kingfisher's ability to operate from open water made it a constant presence over naval task forces, providing an improvised but valuable layer of air defense. Its combat use highlights the desperate and fluid nature of early naval warfare, where any aircraft capable of taking off from water could become a frontline defender. The OS-2U Kingfisher's legacy is not one of aerial dominance, but of adaptability, courage, and the willingness of crews to fight with whatever tools were available in the vast, unforgiving spaces of ocean warfare. The Beriev B-4 was the Soviet Union's dedicated attempt to field a seaplane fighter, capable of defending coastal waters, naval bases, and key maritime approaches during World War II, reflecting the unique geographic challenges faced by the USSR. Operating along vast coastlines and inland seas where airfields were limited or vulnerable, Soviet planners saw value in an aircraft that could rise directly from water to intercept enemy reconnaissance planes and bombers. The B-4 was designed as a compact, single-engine floatplane fighter with modest armament, prioritizing operational flexibility over raw performance. While not as heavily armed or fast as contemporary land-based fighters, it was capable of short-range interception and defensive patrol missions in areas where no other fighters could operate. The aircraft faced numerous development challenges, including engine reliability and limited production capacity, which restricted its operational impact. Nevertheless, the B-4 demonstrated that the Soviet Union recognized the strategic importance of water-based air defense, particularly in protecting naval installations and shipping routes. Its limited service life and small numbers prevented it from becoming a major player in the war, but it remains an important example of how all major powers explored seaplane fighters as a solution to the problem of air control over vast and infrastructure-poor maritime regions.